and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Austria is on the verge of electing its youngest ever chancellor. Does his anti-immigration yet pro-European policies offer a new winning formula for political parties in Europe? And I speak with economist Yukon Huang to learn about his book, Cracking the China Conundrum. Exactly, he's talking about the Chinese economic development style. What insights can he give us about that? We begin today's program in Austria. Austria looks to elect a young conservative star as chancellor. Preliminary results already show Sebastian Kurz's People's Party took more than 30% of the vote in Sunday's parliamentary elections. Kurz began his political career in the party's youth wing and at the age of 27 already served as Europe's youngest ever foreign minister. His miraculous rise culminated in taking leadership of Austria's People's Party just 5 months ago. Let's take a look at how he rose to where he is.
Surely Austria's next chancellor, and therefore the world's youngest national leader. The centre-right People's Party is part of the establishment, but in his short reign at the helm, 31-year-old Sebastian Kurz has shaken it up.
Many said it cannot function, it shouldn't function, but today we received endless confidence from Austrian women and Austrian men. I'm unbelievably grateful and take this confidence as a mandate to carry out changes in Austria for which many of us had hoped.
Without an outright majority, though, Kurz will need help from a potentially controversial source. In other parts of Europe, centrist parties have looked to isolate the far right. In Austria, the Freedom Party is mainstream. Now it's favourite to become the junior partner in a Kurz-led coalition government. The FPO looks likely to score one of its best ever results, nearly tied for second place with the centre-left Social Democrats. The party's leader is prioritising a classic populist mantra in any future government.
At first, it is important to wait for the official result and not start to speculate about coalitions. But one thing I can tell you, the Freedom Party remains true to themselves and to Austrians.
After an unusually vicious campaign, though, few see the two parties that have dominated Austrian post-World War II politics pairing up easily again.
It seems very obvious that the Social Democrats and the Conservatives are an old couple that just needs to be divorced. And the feeling amongst Social Democrats appears to be that any other option but the Conservatives, who have campaigned on a reform agenda, something that would hurt Social Democratic power.
Through a year of elections in Europe, the far right has made many gains, but it hadn't yet formed part of any government. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Vienna.
So, what can we make of the so-called wonder kid of Austrian politics, Sebastian Kurz? Let's turn to our panelists to find out the answer. With me in Beijing studio, Professor Wang Yiwei, Dean with the Beijing, he is actually the director of the Center of the EU Studies at the Renmin University. Sorry, I got the title wrong, but therefore we got it right now. And also, we have in Vienna, Jakob Moritz Ebel, who is a researcher in political communication at the University of Vienna and a member of the Austrian National Election Study. Meanwhile, in London, we invited Professor Ian Beck, Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. I want to welcome to the three of you. Let me begin by asking you, Dr. Ebel, what do you make of the rise of that so-called wonder kid? Is it about his personal charm, or is it about his political party's power, or is it about an overall change in politics in your country?
So it's actually quite fascinating. So as you said, he's not part of a new party as one would think, since it's the party has a new name, party has a new color, but it's actually he's actually the leader of the People's Party, and he campaigned through with the slogan of change. With change, although the People's Party has been in government for 30 years now, and even him as a minister over the last years, he's not a person who's new.
Yeah.
Still, he has campaigned on change. He has campaigned also on immigration policy a lot, and in that, a few months ago, it was a real surprise that his party surged in the polls. Yesterday, on Sunday, however, it wasn't really a surprise anymore. We were expecting this win.
But you still haven't exactly explained to me as to why you think there is a miraculous rise of this kid, quote unquote. Let me go to Mr. Begg for your answer. Probably Dr. Ebel is in his country, as they say, when you're in the mountain, you wouldn't tell how the mountain looks exactly. So I guess from outside the mountain, Mr. Begg, you probably could tell exactly what the shape is of that mountain.
I think we're seeing several things simultaneously. One is not just in Austria, but very similar in Germany. You see disenchantment with the coalitions which have been largely in control of the country for many years. In Austria it goes back far longer, but even in Germany you had the best part of 10 years of Angela Merkel's time in power has been in coalition with the Social Democrats. In France you saw the schism with the old parties. You see the dogfighting going on in the British campaign at the moment. So there is a desire among many electorates for something new. And I think what Sebastian Kurz brings to the party is, on the one hand, youth, and on the other, the idea that he's going to introduce something new to the political dialogue which gets away from the old nostrums. Bear in mind that Austria had this very long-standing model of what you might loosely call Austro-Keynesianism, where there was the cohabitation between the centre-left and the centre-right, and you had the unions having a very powerful role. All of that's being eroded by economic change.
Professor Wang, you've been very attentively listening to your two other colleagues. What really makes it his rise? Mr. Begg used two words. One is youth, the other is something new. Exactly what is that something new? Is it a mirage, or is it for sure?
Well, it's not in Austria, but in many other countries, also many young politicians that are taking power. So definitely the Europe and in total the West need change. Change the people, change the party, change the political system. Difficult to change the political system, so not just change the people and the party, but also change the demand. Maybe let the young guys to do that, and also who have more energy and also new, fresh ideas, not banned by the political correctness, and also not, get out from the political system's constraint. So he very clearly said that Austria first, like Trump in the United States, and also they very clearly said that the refugees and the Muslims may be a challenge, it's even a threat of the national security and national identity. So this makes the voters say this is a true politician, represents our interests and views, not the traditional one.
Then, Dr. Ebel, what do you think? Are the voters really likely to trust his words? From the election result, it seems that they do, but in the long run, they have never tested him, first of all. Secondly, you always know when politicians say something, usually they wouldn't implement it once they are in power. But the question is, in Austrian politics, how much leeway do the voters usually give to those in the very top political office?
So this is a very difficult case that we have here now in Austria, because, as I said before, the campaign was strongly focused on change, and the only major other policy issue was actually immigration politics. There was some talk about an economics program, which in some sorts also was very close to the one from the Freedom Party, so from the radical right party. But generally, we only have two policy fields that we really know where Sebastian Kurz and the new People's Party exactly stand. There, people trust him, particularly on the issue of anti-immigration policies. There, he has made a name of himself over the past years, but even before that. So people trust him, and he probably can be trusted also to deliver on that issue. On the economics issue, although he hasn't had a focus on economics thus far, his party is a conservative party and has issue ownership on the issue of economics. However, on all other issues that are out there, we don't know much about him. Voters will have to trust him for now. But for example, as it was said before, we don't know exactly where this new party or this new branded party stands now on European policies. And that could become at least very relevant in the next few months.
Mr. Begg, what exactly is it? Is this a totally new frame, or it's an old frame with some new paint, namely this beautiful face of a 31-year-old who enjoyed the so-called youngest ever foreign minister status in the past few years and talking with a slogan against the immigrants? Is that the new paint, or is that the new frame, Mr. Begg?
I think it's both. On the immigrant question, what it shows us is that European political systems, whether it's in Austria or elsewhere, are struggling to cope with the very difficult question of how to manage the flow of refugees and other economic migrants into their countries. Austria has been to some extent in the front line. It's not quite been like Italy or Greece, but Austria is the transit route from the southern European countries towards Germany. And that has made Austria very, very touchy about this whole question. Plus, we should remember that Austria was very welcoming to immigrants in the breakup of Yugoslavia 15, 20 years ago. So you find many Slav names already in Austria as a result of that. So there is an overall sensitivity. The reason it's not so much change is that from what I read about the approach by the People's Party, they want to maintain the European links. They are a fairly classic conservative party and calling for lower taxes. What they may be appealing to that is a bit different is a younger generation which across Europe feels it's lost out from recent change. Europe is an aging society, just as China is, and that aging has meant that the younger people in many countries feel that they are the losers from recent developments.
We are seeing this party, Mr. Kurz party, at a critical juncture. The reason we're saying that is because it really depends on which coalition partner they're likely to hold their hand with to decide the future direction of that country. The next big step for Mr. Kurz is picking a suitable ally in parliament. With the Austrian People's Party winning more than 30% of the vote, he is in a position to choose whether he wants to continue the decade-long grand coalition with the center-left under his leadership or enter an alliance with the nationalist, which is the far-right party. So what is likely to be alliance now is the biggest question mark facing all of us these days. We see that, Mr. Begg, in the election of Germany as well. Nobody expected that the AfD would get about 24%, and for the first time ever in decades, the far right enter into the German parliament. Now there we go. We see another one this time with the People's Party and the Freedom Party likely to have a coalition. Far right as well. What do you make of the prospect?
I think we have to remember that 17 years ago we had almost exactly the same scenario when the Freedom Party won pretty well the same share of the vote as it did this time round. And that was condemned by other European countries. It led to 5 years of tension between the rest of the EU and Austria. But things have moved on. The far right has been legitimized in many other countries, such as in France with Marine Le Pen's party, or in Germany with the AfD getting 13% of the vote. So there's been a shift overall in how we perceive the far-right parties. One curiosity, which I think you should put to your Austrian correspondent, is that in theory the arithmetic allows the centre-left, the Social Democrats, and the far-right to form a coalition as well.
Well, is that almost possible? Dr. Ebel, what is your analysis?
So exactly, I would even add another option into the mix, which is a minority government by the list, by the People's Party. But let's first start with the Social Democrats and the Freedom Party. Yes, the Social Democrats are keeping everything open in a way. So they will be talking to the People's Party. They will be talking to the Freedom Party. The People's Party actually should not have any intent of going into a coalition with the Social Democrats, because it will be difficult to show change in, again, a grand coalition.
Right.
But the Freedom Party might have more interest in going into a coalition with the Social Democrats, as they might be at least of equal force in that coalition. But as I said before, there's even the possibility of a minority government under the People's Party, which would mean that the People's Party is the government party alone without a coalition partner, but for each law, for each legislature they want to pass, they could get the votes from different parties whenever they choose.
Well,
so that's actually the most high risk and high reward scenario.
Interesting. We see an interesting coincidence too, Dr. Ebel and Mr. Beck. Well, the Austrians have about 30 days to form a coalition government. Germany, the neighbor, also have 2 months, 60 days to form a coalition government. And at this point, almost half of those 60 days have already been spent. In other words, we're going to see quite an interesting coincidence for the two governments to decide exactly what kind of coalition they want. And as we all know, this is going to be eventually significant for the European politics. Where is it going? Mr. Beck, very briefly from you.
Well, I think still the most likely outcome in Germany is one you and I discussed previously, and that is Jamaica, the black, green and yellow, which is one that could paradoxically give Angela Merkel more power, because she'll be able to set off the Greens against the Free Democrats and sit in the middle and allow them to dispute things. It's not impossible that the outcome in Austria will be similar, with the People's Party having the predominant power in this and only relying to a secondary extent on the others, especially if Dr. Abel's idea of a minority government takes place.
Right.
We shouldn't be surprised, though, at how long it takes to form coalitions. This is in the nature of these forms of democracy. The Dutch just took over 200 days.
Wow. Dr. Ebel, having said that, though, what do you say? What's going on inside Germany, inside Austria, compared to in France and in the UK as well? How do you see the European politics is evolving in some parts of the European map, on the other hand, very dramatically on the other parts of the European map?
So in a way, there is, of course, when there is a right turn in politics, of course, the anti-European resentment there is relevant. So it is going on in Austria, it is there in Germany. Of course, we've seen it now in Great Britain. As I said before, with the People's Party, yes, it should be pro-European. That's what the party stands for generally. But Sebastian Kurz has close ties to Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary, and he's not exactly known for being very pro-European. So I would say that the most likely coalition will be a People's Party, Freedom Party coalition, and in that it will be difficult to actually have a very pro-European stance, and that will be very interesting to see over the next years, how both parties will manage to keep each other in check in that.
Professor Wang, there have been a lot of concern coming from the rest of the world. They're looking at the Austrian politics. For example, with the rise of the far right this time as well, the so-called Freedom Party. And that was, they say, founded by some of those coming from the Nazi parties. And also in the year 2000, as Mr. Beck earlier illustrated, that there was very strong reaction coming from within the European countries and also from outside. Israel even withdrew its ambassador from Austria after that coalition between the central right and the far right being formed. So, Professor Wang, are we seeing a repeat of history, or this time a much more critical juncture? Your judgment here.
Well, it's hard to say. It's very controversial. On the one side, that we are not so worried about the Austrian situation, because let the far right party in power may be better as the opposition party make more troubles in the future. It's not just in Austria, many other countries like France, Germany, also the far right now is taking power, and then they know how to run a country is most difficult in order to opposition party, and they make more troubles. And secondly, I think Austria, for the European policies, more follow Germany traditionally, and joined European Union very late, in only 1995. In an international stage, it's a very neutral state. And so I think it's German taking lead in Austria, don't worry so much. But to be frankly, in the longer perspective, history perspective, that Austria have so many troubles because the very successful of the public diplomacy that put Adolf Hitler as German and Beethoven as Austria. So there are Nazi, sometimes right-wing, some mentality. It's not like a Germany, so they are faced up to the history. So sometimes we were worried about that, the potential of the threat.
I see. Do you have that concern, Dr. Ebel?
I can't really say. So the Freedom Party has its history. There are specific politicians in the Freedom Party that have a problematic past, and I think that this will lead probably to some problems in a future coalition.
To say the least. Of course, we see a lot of changes in the elections. We see young faces. We see the far right getting ever more to the center of the stage. No one would know exactly what would all of this mixed up would mean, but Mr. Begg, certainly Europe is facing a lot of issues. Immigration is only one of them. In fact, most importantly is the economy and what is the future model, the structural reform. Mr. Begg, with what is going on in Austria, do you see any sign that people are finding the real solutions?
Well, I think that Austria is one of the countries in Europe which has moved very much in the direction of high technology goods and services. It's no longer the old model of the economy which we are familiar with. And that in itself becomes an explanation for some of the change. You see it in many other parts of the world as well, that economic change is leading to political change, and some of the resentment of that is on behalf of the people who have lost out from it. In Austria as well, there is a tendency for the young to have voted for change without quite knowing where they're going with it. So we see, I don't think it's an easy, simple explanation for these. There are many currents beneath the surface which are causing the evolutions we're witnessing. And I'd add one other thing, which is when we start to compare, with, for example, with France and the UK, is different electoral systems make it far easier or more difficult for the centre-right or the far-right to assume power in the way it looks like it might do in Austria. It's almost inconceivable in the French system that you would get a far-right government because so much of the centre would oppose it in what ultimately is a two-horse race at the end.
Right. Professor Wang, we only have 15 seconds left for you, but I do want to have some of your final words. Professor.
Austria, our economy, compared to other European countries, I think quite good. The tax also very low, so I hope the young politicians will lead a bright future for Austria and the European Union.
I see. Wang Yiwei, Jacob Morris, Ebel, and Ian Begg, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live. Still to come on our program, I speak with economist Yukon Huang to learn about his book, Cracking the China Conundrum. In fact, he served in the World Bank in China. What does he think the world has overlooked about China's economic wisdom? We'll let him to explain. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday live on CGTN. China's rise is altering global power relations, reshaping economic debates, and commanding tremendous attention. Despite extensive media and academic scrutiny, the conventional wisdom about China's economy is often wrong. In this regard, Dr. Yukon Huang published a book, Cracking the China Conundrum: Why Conventional Economic Wisdom is Wrong. And now let's listen in to what he has to say. And I'm joined by Dr. Yukon Huang, who is a scholar from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace based in Washington. He's joining us now in Beijing. And he's having a book coming out. It's called Cracking the China Conundrum, mainly talking about where is China's economy and how the rest of the world should look at it. Dr. Huang, what a pleasure to have you back in Beijing.
Oh, great to be here.
Is China exceptional?
I think by the standards of performance in terms of other countries, it is unique. No country has grown at 7 or 8 or 9% a year for more than 30 years in the history of mankind. That makes China unique. I think its movement from a socialist economy to something which is more mixed, and how it's done it, is also truly unique.
Having said that, though, should the rest of the world looking at China's economy in a totally different lens compared to how they're looking at the other economies?
Well, I think this is really an important question here, because if they don't look at China's economy with a different lens, they cannot make judgments like, does this country have a financial problem that will eventually become a crisis?
So you are arguing that a total different set of standards and of statistics, the way of looking at statistics, the system of looking at the economy has to be adjusted in order for China. Is that what you're arguing?
I'm an economist, trained as an economist in the West, okay? There's only one set of economic principles, one set of financial principles. All economies adhere to these principles. What is different is the assumptions. For example, in the West, when we look at an economy, we focus upon a company, a firm. It hires people, fires people, it borrows, invests, it grows. And we use that as a way of looking how well the country is doing. China is different because the state plays a very important role. Local governments also function in an economic sense just like a company. We don't have that counterpart in the West. Therefore, if you look at China, you also have to understand what the local governments are doing, how this affects the economy, their role, the competition, the forces. If you miss that, then you will not have a good grasp of what's happening. And then the question, what should be my policies toward China? It'll be incomplete. So the theory is the same, but the assumptions are different.
But that, in a way, is feeding the theory of so-called exceptionalism. Because people are arguing whether the United States should see itself as exceptional. And people could argue that about any other country in the world, including China. So you are saying when you look at China, you have to examine so many other different factors when it comes to Chinese economy. You can't just function as an economist. So anyone who does not have your experience of working in China for 10 years or so would not be able to even to judge where China's economy is and even be able to understand it.
I think the concept of exceptionalism also has what I call a political tone. Exceptionalism means not only am I different, but somehow I'm different in a way that makes me better, or makes me like you should be looking at what I'm doing or following. That's what I call is the undertones of the word exceptionalism. What I would say is China is unique.
This is very complicated. You have just outlined, Dr. Huang. If you look at China's economy, this has never happened before. Let's just say over the past 100 years, probably 200 years. So there are two theories. One is probably like you have to get to understand everything going on in China, the complication of it, in order to understand it. The other thing is that I don't care. There are just certain things I need to look at the economy and eventually come up with a conclusion. Which group would you subscribe to?
First of all, if you are a scholar trying to study China, you can spend your whole life on this.
That's right. And you're still confused.
And you're still confused. So I've been working on China very intensely for now, I'd say, almost 15 years, okay? I'm still learning, okay? And what I've learned saying is you'll never stop, okay? But there are certain things one learns about what will work and what will not work, what is appropriate and not appropriate. Let me give you two things which I really think makes China quite unique when I compare China with other emerging market economies. One of them is that this country, the economy, is extraordinarily competitive. What do I mean by competition? It's always been competitive because it trades with the world, and the global forces impact upon China, and it creates competition. But what makes China really different from, let's say, India, is that there is competition internally in China, across provinces, between state companies and private companies. This is a degree of competition that does not exist elsewhere. So you have internal competition, external competition.
Well, come on, you have it elsewhere. I mean, localities competition, that exists in any other country.
No, if you look at India, the states in India do not compete with each other. Okay? They don't invest to develop whatever. They tend to be protected. Okay? They tend to look at their own, the governor of a state in India feels very much like, I'm only dealing with this. What makes China different? Your governors and party secretaries rotate, okay? But they're also instructed while they're there to try to upgrade and improve the companies, the livelihoods, the poverty conditions.
Right.
If they do well, then the leadership does well, okay? This creates tremendous competition across provinces. This is something we don't see in other kinds of countries. And I would say this kind of uniqueness comes partly from this kind of competitive forces. Remember, this is a mixed economy. Socialist roots. The criticism of socialist economies was always that they were inefficient, that companies couldn't compete. So the big question has always been, how come a socialist economy like China, going through transition, how come it's so efficient in some ways of being able to compete globally?
So how the rest of the world should look at China's economy? We have heard from different economists, all of them big names, well respected so far. Some are arguing about a beautiful prospect of the Chinese economy. Others have been warning every year with different possibilities of the collapse of the Chinese economy.
You make a very valid point. In my book, I point out that here's a country. It's carefully scrutinized and studied by everyone. Yet views about what's happening in its prospects are so extreme. It is because China economy, as we just discussed, doesn't fit any textbook very easily. Okay? Now, I have constructed, for example, what I call a likely path. That likely path basically recognizes the following. No country grows at a huge rate forever. When you get richer, you mature, your growth rate declines. The big issue then is how fast. If China could grow at, say, 5.5% average for the next 10 to 15 years, this would be extraordinary. But it is still declining. So the question is, what can the government do to achieve this? And how should the outside world look at this?
There are several things, Dr. Huang. The world has evolved in terms of the way it looks at China. Before and after the reform and opening up, of course, this is a big moment. Then Asian financial crisis, another big moment. Chinese economy endured that and even prospered despite of the pains it also went through, but certainly stood there for the rest of the world. And then you have the recent financial crisis, 2008, in which China seemed to very much function as a responsible stakeholder. And now you go to another stage in which the world have very different views about what exactly should be globalization. And you see different interpretations of that you see now from the Trump administration and now from the Xi Jinping administration here in China. So are we at another critical stage to study China? And also for China to re-examine itself to figure out a way to go?
Let's step back and ask, what did the global financial crisis do to reshape opinions of everyone about the future growth prospects?
What?
Okay. I think the fundamental issue that's changed is a perception that emerging market economies are now going faster. They're more integrated in the world. This has had a pressure on employment and wages in the West. This is a large factor in creating what I call this feeling of protectionism in Europe and the United States. And they see this as partially the consequence of countries like China and also in India, rest of East Asia. They've become fully into the global markets, and it has led to tremendous productivity increases, consumer goods of higher quality and lower prices, so consumers have benefited. But the concern has been about wages and job creation in the West, which has stagnated. This has led to a fundamental change on the role of trade. Ironically, 10, 15 years ago, the West was in favor of more liberal trade. The emerging market economies were concerned that they couldn't compete. Now it's completely different. Emerging market economies are in favor of more globalization, and the so-called better-off countries are actually in favor of more protectionism. So this is a completely different from what we've seen.
But when you think about 15 years ago, emerging economies, developing countries do not have much voices in deciding what the mechanism should be. And now, when their strength is growing, and when certainly there are different views as to what the best interest would be for this group and for that group, there's likely to be the possibility of conflict about how to define a system or redefine a system.
And there you're absolutely right. And one thing we've seen already, for example, in terms of the governance structure, you're moving far away from the G7 as the sole means for addressing the issue. So the G20 is becoming a much more format, emerging market, developed countries coming together. No one, however, has quite defined what should everyone want to be working toward. And I'll give you a few things that I think are really sensitive issues. Trade and services, the movement of labor, much more contentious issues today. 10, 15 years ago, people were just talking about tariffs, trading goods. Now it's something quite different. The role of state enterprises, environmental issues, labor issues, all much more sensitive today. And there's no consensus about how you deal with this. And there are stark differences between the views of the emerging market economies and the G7 economies.
And therefore, at the end of the day, I think the question is, when we are talking about the Chinese economy, or in the future probably, the economy of the other rising, developing and emerging economies, can we still look at it with many of the earlier indicators, standards, and also perceptions? Or we have to examine it from a very different way?
Well, I think there's a couple things that we've also learned right away. OECD rich countries, they've grown to a certain level. The wages have become stagnant. Employment has become a big issue. China has kind of an unusual situation. In some ways, unemployment was much more of a concern 10 years ago than it was today, because China had to absorb all the people in rural areas, people were being laid off in state enterprises, they had to be employed. Now China's labor force is shrinking. It doesn't have the massive need to generate jobs. But China's well-educated college graduates and other skilled workers continue to have aspirations, and the issues now become wage growth, innovative, productivity, environmental concerns. This is already affecting the leadership here in this country. Environmental concerns, for example, here in China, are much more serious and much more of a focus of public opinion and political opinion than it was 10 years ago. Innovation, job, technology, huge issue here in China. These are issues which we're not seeing as particularly relevant 10 years ago, but today they're entirely relevant. So I do think that these kinds of issues are affecting the Chinese system. They're also having a huge discussion and debate in the West, which is they have not been able to fully resolve the challenges they face on these points.
This is the time of the 19th Party Congress. This is supposed to be one of the most important political meetings for China every 5 years. So you think about China's leadership and the leadership of the CPC. Three things going on. One is internal pressure and demands of the people on environmental issues, the economy getting better, employment rates, and many other things, livelihood. There are a lot of expectations. On the other hand, you also see the rising confidence in China about the country itself, about its, so far, the system, how it works, and possibly about a possible path China could create for the others for inspiration in the future. But the third point is, it also has something to do with the reflections others have about where China is and how they would like to deal with China, for example, from the United States. So you see the Chinese leadership and the CPC leadership probably are looking at this whole array of plates and looking at all these different possibilities. What would this mean for a decision-making process as an observer of China?
Well, let's think about what is fundamentally different economically, which is my focus today, than 10 years ago. You have a huge rising middle class. The country is much more urban than it used to be. Services have become the major driver of growth as opposed to industry. This is a different China than was 10 years ago. dynamic new economies in China in services, e-commerce, the internet. They're becoming globally significant players. Certain sectors in China today have gone faster and are more advanced than they are in the West. China's skipped, for example, the traditional payment systems, so everyone using mobile payment systems.
That's right.
The West is still dependent upon credit cards and cash and checks. China's skipped that totally. China's Alibaba, Tencent, other companies have combined functions in ways which the West has not even thought about. Okay, so this is, in fact, as you say, a much more dynamic, much more confident China in many areas, but there are many other areas which still lag. China is very strange in the sense that when you look at its best performing companies, they're world class. But when you get down to the lower levels, they have many companies whose performance is way below global norms. So this gap is the widest that we've ever seen. So what can China offer to the West now? It actually can offer a huge rising middle class, a system which is much more confident and potentially can be much more open to, frankly, more foreign competition. So I think China should actually say to the West and the United States, let's renegotiate and talk about the bilateral investment treaty.
Well, China's already talking about that, right?
It has been for years.
It'll take a long, long time.
But it's been put on the back burner. The U.S. has been less enthusiastic about it recently because it's been focusing much more on trade. So what you're trying to basically say, China should actually say, actually the issue is no longer trade. The issue is really about market access. That you can invest more in my country for certain reasons and access, and I can invest more in your country. We should actually elevate the bilateral investment treaty as the major forum for discussing issues rather than getting into a protectionist kind of throwing charges against each other, which is unfortunately what's been happening in the last several months.
Dr. Yukon Huang, what a pleasure to have you here in our Beijing studio, and congratulations for that book, particularly focusing on issue about China that the rest of the world have been thinking so hard. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.